There are people who find themselves crying on a Tuesday afternoon for someone they have never met. Not a character in a film, a real person, on a real screen, in a real city on the other side of the world. They watched the story for 11 minutes. They did not choose to feel that way. But there it was, a weight in the chest that lasted 3 days. Surfacing in the car, at 2 a.m., in the shower, a stranger's grief sitting behind their eyes like it belonged there. The feeling was completely real. It just didn't start in them. It happens with rage too, with fear, with a particular kind of collective dread that can settle over a school corridor or a workplace or a comment section, without anyone being able to identify where it began. One person's anxiety moving through a room like weather, a mood that everyone catches and nobody brought. Emotions pass between people without consent. They always have, across rooms and centuries and screens. What that mechanism is for, and what happens when it runs in the wrong world, is a question most people never think to ask. In July of 1518, in the city of Strasbourg, a woman named Frau Troffia stepped into the street and began to dance. There was no music, no celebration, no visible reason. She danced alone, in the summer heat, in a narrow alley near her home. Her husband watched from the doorway, confused, then frightened. She did not stop when he asked her to. She did not stop when darkness came. By the second day, she was still dancing. By the fifth, her feet were bleeding. She hadn't slept. She barely ate, but she kept moving. Compelled by something that looked, from the outside, like an extreme and involuntary joy. Within a week, 30 people had joined her. They had not planned to. They had not gathered intentionally. They simply, one by one, stepped into the same movement. Men and women, laborers and merchants, people who had never spoken to each other. They danced in the street, in doorways, in the square. By the end of the month, there were 400. Strasbourg's city authorities convened. They consulted the physicians who attributed the outbreak to hot blood, an excess of heat in the body that had to be discharged through motion. Their prescription was more dancing. The city cleared the guild hall. They hired professional dancers to keep the afflicted company, believing that if the movement could exhaust itself, it would stop. They brought in musicians. It's worth sitting with that decision for a moment. The people with authority looked at 400 people dancing in the streets and concluded, give them more. Feed the thing. Provide it with structure and encouragement and a proper stage. This was not ignorance. It was the most rational reading of the available evidence. The body wants to move. Let it move until it can't. The dancing spread faster. By August, people were dying. Heart attacks, strokes, exhaustion so complete the body simply stopped. The music was silenced. The guild hall was closed. The physicians revised their position. The church weighed in with a different diagnosis: sin and divine punishment, and the specific anger of Saint Vitus, who had jurisdiction over the afflicted. The dancing continued. The last records of the outbreak appears in September of 1518. Then it simply stops. 400 people consumed by an unstoppable movement, and then nothing. No gradual recovery, no official resolution. The city moved on, and what had passed through those bodies in a summer of heat and dying went for another 5 centuries unnamed. The label that eventually arrived is mass psychogenic illness, or in older texts, mass hysteria, a shared psychological state expressing itself through shared physical symptoms, spreading through a population via social transmission rather than biological infection. The label is accurate as far as it goes. It describes the shape of the thing. What it doesn't explain is the inside of it. Why Strasbourg in that summer? Why 400 people and not 4 or 4,000? Why dancing specifically? Why not weeping or silence or collapse? Why feeding the movement made it worse? Why it stopped? These questions tend to be passed over quickly because naming the category feels like an answer. It isn't. It is the beginning of one. There is something the mass hysteria framing tends to set aside. Strasbourg in 1518 was not a city having an ordinary summer. The previous years had brought famine, then syphilis, then a second wave of plague, a population that had been living inside a low, unceasing dread, a collective anxiety with no outlet, no resolution, no visible horizon. The city was full of people carrying something too large to put down and too formless to name. Then Frau Trophia stepped into the street. She wasn't performing joy. Historians now believe she was discharging something. And as she moved, the people watching her, carrying their own version of the same unbearable weight, felt the pull of the same release. The feeling didn't need language to travel. It didn't need consent. It moved through the population the way weather moves through a landscape. Not asking, not explaining, simply arriving. By August, people were dying from it. Feet worn through to the bone. Hearts that stopped after days of continuous movement. Bodies that had caught something they could not put down, even when they wanted to. The physicians called it hot blood. The church called it sin. Both were reaching for a framework that could contain what they were seeing. The obvious modern reading is, this is trauma, finding a collective expression. A suppressed dread, erupting into the body because the mind had no other language for it. Shared stress, shared symptoms, shared contagion. This explanation is not wrong. It describes something real. But it still doesn't explain the mechanism, the how of the traveling, and it is the mechanism, not the label, that matters. Social contagion is not a malfunction. It is a feature, the oldest social technology the human species possesses. Older than language, older than agriculture, older than any cultural system we have ever built. The capacity to catch emotion from other people, their fear, their grief, their rage, their panic, did not emerge because humans were weak or irrational or susceptible. It emerged because humans lived in groups where shared survival depends on shared response. When one member of the band felt fear, the group needed to feel it immediately, without the time cost of verbal communication, individual assessment, or conscious deliberation. The contagion mechanism is that alarm system. It bypasses individual thought because individual thought is too slow. The fear travels faster than words because it was built for a world where being half a second behind the group means not surviving the afternoon. Mirror neurons, limbic resonance, emotional synchrony, these are not poetic metaphors. They are measurable biological processes. The hardware of a system that allowed small groups of social mammals to respond as a single organism under threat. The people in Strasbourg were not broken. Their nervous systems were doing exactly what they were built to do, syncing with the collective emotional state. The collective emotional state, after years of famine and plague and unprocessed dread, had found the only form available to it. The mechanism found a form. That is what it does. Here is the problem. The system was calibrated for groups of roughly 150 people, in a physical world with real threats and traceable origins. You caught the group's fear, you ran. The threat resolved, or it didn't, and the nervous system returned to baseline. The feeling arrived with a cause. The cause had a response. The response had an end. We are now running the same mechanism continuously, through screens, on a feed of curated distress from billions of people we will never meet, in cities we cannot find on a map, experiencing losses that have no proximity to our own lives and no available response. The mechanism cannot distinguish between the fear in the person standing next to you and the fear coming through a screen from the other side of the world. It fires anyway. It catches anyway. hundreds of times a day, for events that have no predator to run from and no action that resolves them. The teenagers, whose self-harm patterns spread through friend groups in measurable documented waves, they are not weak. The classrooms that produce the same anxiety systems in 12 students within a month. The workplaces that catch a collective despair that nobody brought and nobody can put down. The communities whose mood shifts after a single broadcast event moving through millions of people simultaneously. These are not failures of individual psychology. They are ancient social hardware functioning exactly as designed in an environment it was never designed for. There is no clean resolution to this. You cannot remove the contagion mechanism. It is not separable from the capacity for empathy, for love, for the bonds that make human life possible. They are the same system. You do not get one without the other. But knowing it exists changes something. Not everything. Not the grief that arrives at 2 a.m. for a stranger you will never meet, or the diffuse fear that settles in after an hour of news, or the anger that moves through a group and leaves everyone slightly diminished and no one sure of its origin. Those things do not dissolve because you understand their architecture, but they become navigatable in a way that shame about being too sensitive never quite manages. When the weight arrives, the one that doesn't belong to your immediate life, the one that came from a screen in a city you cannot name, it is real. It is also the alarm system firing in a world that provides no appropriate response. There is no predator to run from. There is no action the grief maps to. The mechanism is doing its job in an environment that has given it no off switch and no endpoint and no resolution. Frau Troffia danced for 6 days in a summer street. In 1518, for reasons nobody fully understood, in a city full of people carrying something too heavy to name. In a year that had given them nowhere to put it. The people who followed her were not mad. They were not sinful. They were not weak. They caught something that was already in the air because they were built to. They were built to catch it too. The question is whether you know what you're carrying, and whether, when you feel the weight of something you cannot trace to its source, you have the language to ask, did this start in me or did it travel?